All right, go for it, Carl. It's already 17 minutes past.
All right. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to call it. We're going to have to go online. What I'm going to do is skip the first couple of sections and go straight to the origins of life. But firstly, we'll do the introductions for those of us that we do have, and we'll take it from there. So, yeah, if you can hear me but you can't speak, there's not much I can do. You'll just have to listen. I'll work with who we've got. Just mean that we'll have some questions whereby there is no name specifically to them. So I am going to need people to jump in. Guy, you're the only one, I think, with a good connection off-site. You'll have to wave at me if you want to answer the question. Okay. Cool. Thanks, Guy. All right. I'm going to hit the broadcast button.
So what I propose you do, go ahead. What I propose you do, Carl, is that you ask the person who's meant to ask the question if they can hear us and they can answer. Go ahead. If not, send it over.
Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome from Cape Town to the second Access online live event. We apologize that we are starting a little bit late today. We've had a few technical issues getting people online, although we did promise that we would start a little bit later in order to accommodate those coming from labs. I'd like to welcome everyone to the discussion today and thank everybody for making the effort to please. I'd like to thank welcome everyone to the discussion today and thank everybody. That was that.
Oh, I see.
Okay. Apologies, I'll say that again. I'd like to welcome everybody to the discussions today and thank you all for making the effort to get here. I know that a lot of people have had a lot of problems, both with internet connectivity issues, but also actually with campus protests. I know, for example, that the WITS group have had a long journey to get here. So thank you ever so much for making all of that effort. Today, we're going to be looking at your questions on the biology and chemistry of what makes planet Earth habitable. We are going to give a quick recap first of where we've got to, and then we're going to go into your questions on that part. So just firstly, the effort to please. I'd like to welcome everyone to the discussion today. Thank everybody. That was that.
Oh, I see.
Apologies, I'll say that again. My apologies. Let me try again. Last time. Sorry for the technical issues. Okay, so we're going to go through the biology and chemistry of why the planet's habitable. But firstly, just going to give you a quick recap of where we are. We started on the Habitable Planet course all of 7 weeks ago now, where we made the observation that out of all the planets in the universe, about 10,000 or more of them known now, Earth is the only one so far that we know to be habitable. And we started building subsequently more complicated models to try and understand why that is. And so we started with a really simple physical model. We looked at the idea that Venus is too hot, Mars is too cold, and so maybe Earth is habitable because it's the right distance from the sun. And if you remember, all that time ago, we had Sarah give the talk, Not Too Hot, and she looked at a simple model. We got rid of all the complexity from Earth. We got rid of the plants, the animals, the people, and we just considered the planet to be a ball of rock of a given color. And we needed to recap some basic physics. We needed to learn about albedo, conservation of energy, etc. And we found out that a planet like that would be far too cold to support life. It would be a chilly -15. And then throughout the first few weeks, we started to add to this simple physical model, gradually adding layers and layers of complexity. And we added a static ocean and a static atmosphere, and then we made them move, and we had a moving ocean and a moving atmosphere. And at each stage, we found that that wasn't enough to explain why Earth is habitable. And so now we're coming through to, and then we looked at past climates and how the Earth has been constantly changing. So that we had a nice online event looking at the physics, but we found that actually our purely physical model is still lacking in something in explaining why Earth is habitable. So that's where we come to today. We're going to come to adding in chemistry and one specific type of chemistry, which is the chemistry of living things, what we call biology, into that model. It's two very interesting types of science. One, because biology is the only science that you can do without any understanding of maths. My biology friends tell me that in biology, division is the way multiplication happens, which makes absolutely no sense at all. And chemistry is an interesting science because, as everyone will know, it's my favorite and therefore the best. Just a quick note before we head on in. We will have another, in our model, we next move on after the biology and chemistry to introducing a very interesting specific species of animal called Homo sapiens. Our next lectures will start looking at their evolution, and they will be particularly the focus of the last part of the course. And so in the last part of the course, we start to think about how they came about and the things that they've been doing to perturb the habitability of the planet. And so because we're coming to that, to some extent in this session, I want to pretend that those Homo sapiens don't exist, okay, because they haven't been added to our model. Now, it's a little bit difficult because when we come to things like biodiversity, they are clearly quite important. So I've tried my best to separate your questions into the ones that are really more on the human side of things will be in the next online event. And these ones tend to be more just the ones on the plants, the animals, etc. Okay, so without further ado, we're going to jump into your questions. I'm aware that we missed out on some of the sections last time on paleoclimate and plate tectonics. If we have time, we will catch up on that. Where's that?
Something.
Tando, hello. How are you? Hello. How are you?
Oh, hi. I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
We have you, which is brilliant. But can you put headphones in because I can hear me?
Yes, stay in.
Ah.
Just mute.
Okay, let me just. I'm going to mute you.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe. If you want to speak, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, cool.
I can't mute you for some reason. Oh, there we are. Brilliant. Okay, fantastic.
Cool.
All right, but firstly, before we delve into the science, I'm going to let the various panel members introduce themselves. As is customary for the Habitable Planet online events, they're going to introduce themselves using questions from our iPlaneteers, our national student body. So we have 3 questions that I'd like everyone to answer when introducing themselves. One from the Najabulo, my apologies, as I made the disclaimer last time, I am English. I equally murder Afrikaans and African names. Najabulo asks, thank you. What interests you the most about Earth system science? And Jele asks, how do you manage to keep all of this information in your head? And Sharisha asks, if you weren't studying science, what career would you have chosen? What would you be? And so those 3 questions: what interests you? How do you manage to keep all that information? And if you weren't a scientist, what would you be? As well as just a little bit about yourselves from everyone. I'll start on my left with Dr. Sweijd.
Hi. Okay, so I'm Neville. There's a comment here that says the N is silent. What does that mean? Oh, Jabulo.
Jabulo.
Right.
Thank you, Jabulo.
So I'm Neville Sweijd. I am the current director of the Access program. And I am I'm trained, as it were, as a marine biologist. I did my PhD here at UCT, and I worked in the molecular biology of abalone, or perlebune, as some of you might know it. The question, first of all, is what interests me? What interested me?
What interests you the most about Earth system science? How do you manage to keep all the information?
I don't have a particular interest. I'm very lucky because I sit in a position where I engage with a whole lot of people right across the whole range of Earth system science. And it would be wrong of me to say I have a particular interest. But what I do have a fascination with, which has been my kind of career has been a subcellular level of things. So things happen at a subcellular level within a cell, which actually scale up to organism and ecosystem levels. And it's incredible to me that there are these connections between things at such a small scale with things at such a global scale. So that's really been fascinating. How do I keep stuff in my head? Well, I don't, I guess. I think I learn as I go. I memorize, or I learn to remember key issues, broad brush strokes. It's all a question of level of detail. On occasions, I get down to extreme detail when engaging with people at that level. And the third question, Carl, was what would I be doing if I wasn't doing this? Hell, I think I might be a chef, I might be a medical doctor, or a radio talk show host. Those would be my choices.
You'd love to believe that. All right, I'll go around the room. Konanani.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rendani Mraudzi. I'm a lecturer in environmental resources at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Well, my interests are in climate science communication. I keep on equipping myself by, getting information from a wide variety of sources, both national and international. So if I were not, in this platform, obviously, I see I've got a soft spot for radio. Obviously, radio DJ, that's my, sort of other, interest, or music compiler, because I'm a slave of soul and R&B.
And down his smooth jams. All right.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Basanda, and my surname is Nondlazi. I am a computing master student, and I'm at SANBI. What interests me in earth system science is the interconnectedness of things. Some call it the third universal truth. Earth system science in itself appreciates the interconnectedness, and that interests me a lot about earth system science. And I keep most of the information in my head through association. I associate things. And if I wasn't doing what I'm doing, well, I really don't know. Probably I would try and be whatever would give me the most money, now that I know that love does not keep you happy all the time.
Thanks, Basanda. Raissa.
Hi, I'm Raissa. I work for a company called Lwandle Technologies, and we do marine environmental consulting. I was originally trained as a marine chemist, and the problem with coming last is that other people have already said what you were going to say.
I've lost.
So, what interests me the most in Earth system science, like Basanda said, the interconnectedness of things is absolutely amazing. And going back to what Neville said, you have these scales. You have a tiny little bacteria, a tiny little cell, and the difference that this makes to a global scale. I find this absolutely fascinating. And again, like they said, how do you keep this information in your head? Well, you don't. And for me, it's like learning to know where's the information. So if I'm looking for something, I will say, okay, where do I find this, and how does this help me understand where I need to get with this? If I wasn't a scientist, maybe I'd be a writer. I love languages. Maybe I'd try to be learning all the languages I can.
Nice. Well, interesting, actually, coming through that nobody keeps the information in their head. Yeah. It's a question that the students ask a lot, but I mean, you must keep some of it, right? Somehow.
I think seeing it over and over, you
repetition.
Start remembering.
Yeah. Repetition.
I like what connections, and that's really how I remember things. By trying to keep connection, by trying to keep clean ideas. But there are other people there to introduce.
Yes. Let's try. People coming in and out. Let's try going from left to right here. I'm going to ask Fabian. Are you with us? Can you unmute yourself and introduce yourself? We can't hear you, Fabian. You are unmuted. Do you have a microphone?
The microphone doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, you're muted again now. Now you're unmuted, but we can't hear you, Fabian. So I'm going to come back to you. Your microphone's not working. So, Guy, you're next. Can we go to you?
You have to unmute yourself. No, can't hear you. You have to unmute your microphone. Have you done that?
There you go. Speak, Guy. Oh, now you're muted again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Just pressing the wrong buttons. I'm a scientist. What interests me, I think what's really interests me a lot is the role of the human animal in the Earth system. So I've become extremely interested in that, and how they interact with the Earth system. Maybe I should just say I'm basically a plant physiologist, and I've morphed into more of a systems ecologist, and over the last 10 years been involved in climate policy. So I'm at University of Stellenbosch, so I've gone over quite a large range of scales. The people in the Earth system interest me a lot. How do I keep the info in my head? I've got a pretty good memory. I've always had a good memory, and I read a lot as a kid. So I remember stuff quite well, and I try to put things together in chains. So when you lecture a lot, you tell stories over and over again, and you find you remember more stuff, and you get more and more detail, you retain more detail. So repetition, reading, talking about your work really helps you remember it. If you have to teach something, you tend to know it a lot better than if you just have to learn it. I've found once you start teaching, you really have to know your stuff. And what would I have been? I think if my parents had allowed me to do art at school, which I wanted to do, I would have been an architect.
Yeah, interesting.
That's where I wasn't allowed to do art, so I had to do geography, science, and Latin.
Latin, wow. It's showing your age there, Guy. I think that's really interesting, though, the point about narratives. I think that's a really important point. We learn and memorize things much better if there's a narrative attached to them. All right, thank you, Guy. Spey, are you able to speak?
Hello?
Hi, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, I am Siphelele Nsibande from KZN, registered for Masters in Geography and Environmental Sciences in the University of KwaZulu-Natal. You can't hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Name is Siphelele. Surname Nsibande from KZN, registered for Master's degree in Environmental Sciences and Geography. The first question was what interests me most, but it's system science, so I can easily get away with just copying the other people's answer and say the interconnectedness. But really, it is that the interconnectedness. It's like it's everything coming together nicely. Each and every components of the Earth being studied together, of which I think by now people do understand that multidisciplinary approaches are the way to the future. So Earth System Sciences allows us that opportunity. And yeah, and knowing all the information, I think like revisiting and as guys said, lecturing, you do like get some of it stuck in your head, but you won't know everything, of course. Whenever you have to maybe get into a discussion about something, you need to refresh your mind. So if I wasn't a scholar in science, I'd be traveling the world. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. Thank you, Raissa. Thank you, Spey. Tando, can you introduce yourself? You'll have to mute your microphone. We can see a picture of you. Tando, are you there?
Skip.
Okay. All right. Wendy, can you introduce yourself to us?
So remember to unmute.
Remember to unmute first, yes.
Hi.
Hi, Wendy.
Yeah. Oh, I prefer to be called Konanani, actually.
Sorry, Konanani, hi.
My name is Konanani Maiwashe. I'm originally from Pretoria, but I'm studying environmental sciences at the University of Venda. I'm doing my final year. What interests me in earth system science is because we get to study everything and how everything is connected, and how we can actually find ways in how everything actually affects one system, affects the other systems. And if the information, I study a lot, I enjoy studying, I enjoy what I do, so it's not easy to forget something that you enjoy. And if I wasn't studying science, I'd be a performer. I've always loved art and performance art.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Wendy. That was lovely. Wendy, nice one. By the way, we got our test microphones on. Wendy, by the way, has joined us by virtue of the fact that she's currently top of the class of the iPlaneteers nationwide. Currently, so far in the online exams, Wendy has only got one question wrong out of a total of 60 questions, which is quite incredible. So well done. Tando, I think we have you. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Hello?
Yes, perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. Hello, I'm Thandolwethu Jele. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I am doing a BSc in agribusiness and I'm majoring in wildlife management science. I'm sorry, I missed some parts of the conversation, but if are we still on the first question, my interest on earth system sciences?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes. I'd say what interests me the most about earth system sciences would be that it is up. We thought that the earth was basically just physics. It's just physics. But then when you get to realize that earth system sciences is more than just physics, it involves other components of life. It involves biology. It involves other parts of environmental sciences and all those things. As Siphelele mentioned, it's the interconnectedness of the different parts of the earth that makes the study so amazing. And the fact that you get to realize that other components such as biodiversity, well, that would be the perfect example, contributes to the habitability of this planet also. It's just the small little parts of the earth that make the study so amazing, I guess, and so interesting.
Nice one. Thank you, Tando. Nice one. Thank you, Tando. Okay, please mute yourself again. Please mute yourself again. I don't think we're going to be able to hear from Zanele or Fabian.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Fabian, yes, we can hear you.
There now. Good.
Cool. Please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Fon from the University of Zululand. Specifically, I'm in the Department of Agriculture and I'm an animal scientist. Well, when we asked about what is my interest in earth science systems, one of the very first things that I would say is the mystery of the connectedness. I always bring it into my field. You would see that my animals on the farm, they don't really breed at any time. They have a breeding season. And that breeding season is a
Manuel asked the question as to explain, how do we think the first cells came about on Earth?
Right, so I've got 10 short little points to make. And the first is that there are, in fact, several theories as to how life came about on this planet. We know that life had to have come about because there was a time on this planet before there was life. So life did develop, emerged on this planet. And the theories are all scientific theories. Of course, there are those people that have belief systems. Whether those belief systems are incompatible with the science is another debate. They don't have to be necessarily, I don't believe. But we're approaching this from a fairly scientific point of view. The first problem we've got in trying to answer this question is we first have to define what we mean by life. What is life? How do you define something as living or something which is organic, perhaps, but dead or not alive? And so that's a conundrum, and even there's several theories. The one I like to use, although I know that it's disputed, is that the minimum criteria is that the organism or the properties of a living entity are that it reproduces and that it metabolizes. Those are which does lead us to the eternal debate that Carl and I usually have, which is, for example, is a virus a living organism or not? Because a virus does replicate, it doesn't have its own metabolism, but it exists and it affects life and it affects living organisms. So that's a debate we could have. So before life is to be established on Earth somehow, we first have to have the constituents of life, and the constituents of living things are organic molecules. And so the question is, well, where do organic molecules come from? And this science developed in the 50s with a guy called Urey, who did some experiments in the United States, where he tried to emulate, if you like, the conditions on Earth as it was at 3.5–4 billion years ago. Basically, we had basic constituents like hydrogen, although that's a bit of a debate, nitrogen, methane, water, a couple of minerals, etc., etc. And you put this together in a particular set of conditions under different kinds of pressure, under different kinds of temperature regimes, and he created in a flask and added lightning and in some of it created by this chemical process. And we know that this works because we've also seen it, in fact, on some meteorites that have landed on our planet. Those meteorites possess some organic molecules. So these are complex molecules made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., etc. So once we have the organic molecules, now the question is, how do we organize it in such a way that it becomes living? And again, we have to define what we mean by living. And again, there are several theories as to how this happened. I just want to throw in something one step back to say that another theory, the theory of panspermia, is that life or organic matter on Earth actually originated from meteorites and didn't come from this planet spontaneously, which would make us all alien ultimately. But be that as it may, so now we've got organic molecules. How do we get life? And again, there are several theories. One of the big conundrums in replicating molecules, so molecules that can replicate themselves, that provide a sort of a template so that the molecule itself can replicate and become a long chain of molecules, for example. The question is, how is that regulated? And sometimes it's regulated by the medium in which it is. So there's a theory about clay, there's a theory about temperature and ice that provided the mechanism for this to happen. But ultimately, it is really a debate and a theory as to what there's no definitive proof about which are the mechanisms by which molecules originally became organized. And then there's the debate about which came first. Was metabolism that led to the genetics, which then provides the template for life, or was it genetics that came first and provided the template for life and molecules? So proteins, if you like, versus DNA or RNA. And again, there's several theories about the RNA world, the protein world, and which came first. So that's not a resolved issue. But either way, the point being that some way or other replication of molecules occurred. And then ultimately, the idea of a cell. And so, again, it is postulated that these are spontaneous events that either happen once or simultaneously in a particularly good environment where organic films were created, organic bubbles were created, creating an environment inside that bubble which is more stable, and that became propagated somehow or other, and so cells emerge. And the process then would lead on to more and more organized, better organized, spontaneously evolving material, a living material, which at some point or another becomes life. And then my final point I wanted to make really was that we have, of course, a fossil record of very, very old forms of life, but we have extant forms of life today, such as the archaea, or the prokaryotic bacteria, some call it, which are very primitive forms of life, very simple forms of life. And what I wanted to just say, to show you, if you like, to demonstrate the fact that there's a range of different histories that all are expressed in different ways in our living world today. I'll take the human as a good example, since the human is really what some of us regard as the pinnacle of evolution. We have in our cells, and this is one of the questions I believe, we have in our cells mitochondria. Plants have chloroplasts. And inside those mitochondria is DNA. So DNA in your body, in your cells of your body, are not only found in the nucleus of the cells, but are also found in the cytoplasmic organelles known as mitochondria and chloroplasts. And there are one or two others, in fact. Now, the question is, well, why is there also DNA inside these particular organelles? And the answer is that once those organelles were independent organisms, and that through the process of endosymbiosis, where the organisms, if you like, learned to live symbiotically and derived advantage, so let's say in the case of the mitochondrion, dealing with a toxic chemical called oxygen, which was very toxic to life, with a metabolic pathway to utilize oxygen, that provides both the advantage of survival and also provides energy to the host organism. And the benefit to the organelle is that it gets a stable environment and replicates quite safely. So there was a symbiotic relationship formed, and that is how eukaryotic cells developed. And so we could survive in the oxygen world, which came later. So what I'm just trying to point out is that in the genetic history of our cells, our own bodies, there's a story of the evolution of life. And you will see, just to summarize then, that there are, if you like, we are hybrid organisms. We have in our cells, in our own bodies, or a DNA which operates and we depend on from different organisms. That's what we amalgamation of that part. And that just explains a little bit about, if you like, the different stages of history. I think I could go on forever, but I shouldn't. So
no, that's brilliant. Thank
there.
you.
Okay.
Thank you, Neville. Just very quickly, 2 points to pick up there that I enjoyed. Can we have a quick show of hands of the scientists as to who thinks that viruses are alive? Those are awake, and also put your hands up. Hands up now if you think viruses are alive. A bit of a split.
I don't care.
Well, you have to care. It's part of the thing. Okay, so just a nice illustration of something that scientists don't agree on.
Well, I wouldn't say I don't care, but I think sometimes like splitting hairs over a tiny definition isn't necessarily important, but what they do is more important to me. That's where I sit.
Okay, fair enough.
I just want to add, there's a question that's come over the comments here. But the question is this, but that were the crux of the issue is, am I right, Doc? Why would a prokaryotic cell concatenate the DNA of another organism? Now, I don't think I understand the question because I don't know what the word concatenate means.
Concatenate is from maths, when you join two things together.
Okay, so they're not joined together. That's important, okay? In fact, they're separate pieces. They replicate. The DNA in the organelle replicates independently of the DNA inside the nucleus, right? So they're very separate things. Of course, the organelle can't survive because it's sacrificed much of its biological function and really is reduced down to some fundamental things. But let me just say something about the mitochondrial DNA. You all learned, I assume, that that DNA is universal, right? That the DNA code is universal. There's the 4 nucleotides, but in fact that's not the case. The nucleotides, one of the nucleotides in mitochondrial DNA is not the same, and the coding system that the mitochondria use is different to the coding system that the nuclear DNA uses. So that means that, in fact, it's not so universal. So that's just to illustrate the point that the DNA inside the inside the mitochondria is actually of distinct origin, has a different, if you like, evolutionary pathway. The same is true for the chloroplast, by the way. And I can just give one more example.
Okay, quickly.
A quick one is that we do see this happening today again, endosymbiosis, but not in the same way. And there's a very famous case of a slug, a sea slug, which eats marine algae, which is a photosynthetic alga, a very green one. And what it does is it manages to capture the organelles from the cells that it digests and get them into the tissue of its mantle so that the chloroplasts continue to photosynthesize outside the cell of the organism in this animal. So if you like, this is an animal, a dinkum animal, which is now photosynthesizing by virtue of its hosted, its captured chloroplasts. And there are a couple of other examples like that of endosymbiosis. Coral reefs, for example, are another one. So there are examples, living examples of that process. Yeah.
Okay, nice one. So I think that very nicely answers Khaled's question on endosymbiosis. And I think he said online there that he's happy. So I'm going to put that one to bed. We had a question from Tessa about the primordial conundrum, and I think that you've tackled that very nicely. Iria asks, life on Earth began 4.5 billion years ago, but photosynthesis only started 2.5 billion years ago. Does that mean that life started without photosynthesis? And the answer to that is actually yes, which seems quite incredible that you have such an obvious source of energy in the sun and that wasn't being utilized. But it would appear clearly from the fossil record and from the state of minerals, which we'll come to in rocks, that for the first 2 billion years, life got all of its energy through a process called chemosynthesis, where the energy is derived from chemical energy and not from radiation from the sun. So you're absolutely right. For a long, long period on Earth, photosynthesis was not the major way that energy was gained. Oxygen wasn't being produced, and life on Earth was using just chemical energy.
I need to make a point about that. So why that's significant, the fact that photosynthesis came later, is because the product of photosynthesis is oxygen, right? One of the products of photosynthesis is oxygen. And oxygen then, so what happens is photosynthesis starts, oxygen is produced, but because oxygen is so reactive, none of that oxygen makes it into the atmosphere. And in fact, it just oxidizes everything. In fact, the oceans, they say the oceans rusted, that's the term, full of iron. Now they're very limited in iron because you've got iron oxide as a consequence of all oxygen slowly being produced. Only once all of that oxygen had saturated the terrestrial and marine environments did start emerging into the atmosphere. And so we started getting atmospheric oxygen. But the production of oxygen itself was toxic to life, which developed in an anoxic environment. So I admitted that right at the beginning. One of the conditions for those experiments that were done was that life developed in an anoxic environment. So oxygen actually presented a threat to life. And it was that adaptation to living with oxygen that led to the endosymbiosis and the utilization of oxygen as an actual source of chemicals in metabolism.
Thanks, Neville. And actually linking into that, Siphelbert asks, how was the atmosphere formed? And so that's interesting that there was really two atmospheres that were formed. The Earth's original atmosphere, which really wasn't very habitable, at least as far as human beings are concerned, was just formed by the gravity of Earth retaining a lot of the gases that were there when the Earth first condensed. So we know that the Earth condensed under what's called the nebula hypothesis, part of the rest of the solar system. The heavy material sank to the bottom of the Earth under gravity, so the Earth's core is made of heavier elements like iron. Some of the gases that were there were trapped by gravity, and that was mostly CO2 and methane. So you had an atmosphere that for us would be very toxic. But our modern atmosphere was actually created by life, by these first photosynthetic organisms who firstly oxidized the rocks, and then oxidized the oceans, and then lastly oxidized the air. And that oxygen actually is what forms the ozone layer, and that ozone layer allowed life to come out of the oceans, because before that we had very, very energetic UV radiation on the surface of the Earth. And that oxygen links us nicely to a question from Anna Mandler, who asks, is oxygen in the atmosphere definitive evidence of Earth's habitability? And that's, I think, a really, really fascinating question. And one, as a chemist, I would argue with yes. That there's a really interesting observation that James Lovelock made when he first proposed the Gaia hypothesis. And that's basically that if you take a box of atmosphere of any planet in the solar system and you leave it for 100 years, then that box of atmosphere will still be exactly the same. So you take a box of Martian atmosphere and you isolate it for 100 years and come back and measure it, the chemicals in that atmosphere will be the same, except for Earth. Earth is the only exception, whereas if you take the atmosphere, it will react and it will change. And those reactions are driven by oxygen. It's a very unstable chemical. It wants to react with stuff. It's produced by life, and it has to be continually produced by life. Otherwise, it would very quickly react and form rocks. So the presence of free oxygen in the atmosphere of a planet appears to be definitive evidence of life, definitive evidence that something is continually making it so that it doesn't get used up and put into the rocks. Okay, so that's interesting. And so on the origins of life, we had those questions around how life formed on Earth, but then there were some other ones which started to look at the search for extraterrestrial life. Unfortunately, guys, that really fitted in better in the last talk. We had astronomers here, but we will do the best we can to help you. Perseverance asks, since scientists are currently searching for other habitable planets, what technology are they using? How many exoplanets have they found? Who names them? And can I please get a planet named after me? Raissa?
So as Carl said, I'm not an astronomer, but I volunteered to answer this question because I hang out around astronomers sometimes and people were really interested in space, and then I've learned these things. And then I also went and looked up information before so that I wouldn't tell you nonsense. So first, you can name any planet after yourself, but that doesn't mean that everyone else is going to call it. So I actually looked at this because I've seen sites where they say, buy yourself a star, name a star after yourself. And so I went up and I saw that the International Astronomical Union are the ones who name planets and stars. And there's a vote, there's a procedure, and they say, well, you can, all of those other sites are scams, and if you buy it, you'll have a star planet named after you, but no one else is going to call that. On the more serious stuff, so exoplanets, there's a number of different ways to find them, and most of them revolve around observing the skies. And the first one is that planets generally revolve around a star. So now, as your planet is going around a star, it will block some of the light. And if we keep seeing that pattern, it can kind of tell us, okay, there must be something blocking the light, and that might be a star. Another thing that planets do is that because of their gravity, they can wiggle the stars. They can actually wiggle the stars. And then if we see stars wiggling in, again, like a certain pattern, we can deduct that there might be a planet there. Similarly, so when there's two stars that are lined up, you can actually, that can also, and if there's a planet there, it can distort the light. And that, again, by observations, astronomers can say, okay, there might be a planet. The final, one of the very rare ways of actually seeing it is when they see a planet by simple observations, but that's very, very rare. There was a lot of questions in there.
I think you pretty much covered them.
Yeah.
How you find them.
But yeah, sorry, you can't have a planet.
I suppose.
You can if you pay me.
I'll take your money.
In lectures, we can just start changing the names. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we could start it here. Name a planet after Neville. Which one is the question? Amanda and Kelly Bongile both asked the similar sort of question about, does life exist outside of Earth and how can humans detect it? I think going back to the first lecture, in the beginning, we looked at Drake's equation. I mean, from a statistician's point of view, it appears almost certain that there is other life in the universe. If what we understand about life is true, then just by laws of statistics, the universe is so vast that no matter how unlikely an event, it appears almost certain to happen, and to happen multiple times. But it's one of the great questions of science as to, are we alone? I think to some extent, Raissa covered how can we detect this. One of the big things is that scientists are generally agreed that if other life, intelligent life, wanted to be found, it would put out some kind of regular signal, because that would distinguish from natural chaos in the rest of the universe. And so there's lots of projects looking for signals out there, whether it be in light or microwave or radio wave. And the surprising thing, given my first statement, is that so far nobody has found anything.
I also want to add, so when Carl mentioned the theory of James Lovelock, so one of the things that James Lovelock says that if you look at a planet's atmosphere and you see that those gases are not going to react together, then that means there's no life there. But if you look at the atmosphere and it's like there's reactive gases that are just staying at a sort of constant concentration, you're actually quite likely to have life there. So going back to that point of interconnectedness and how all things fit together as
well. Just comments that have arrived. First of all, Siasanga says, wow, that's such an exciting eye-opening presentation. Thanks. Sorry, D. How does the moon, with its effects on our tides, affect our chemical composition of ozone? I'm not sure that it does.
I don't think it, for any reason.
Very directly.
I mean, it has gravity, so I guess it might pull.
Did you know the moon was part of Earth? I think, yes, the moon did form at the same time, right? So it's the same bit of Earth. Maybe it has a microgravitational, maybe it has a microgravitational pull. That was the answer to the previous question. Okay, and then a guy had wanted to add something to the questions. Oh, you haven't finished yet?
No, I was just reading a comment that was on the screen.
Okay.
Guy, did you say?
Guy wanted to say, or just throw in something into this question, into this thing.
I just wanted to say that two scientists have just published evidence in the Astronomical Society of the Pacific that there are signs of intelligent life in 234 solar systems because
of
the way that there are these suns that are blipping on and off at a certain frequency that's impossible to explain by any other method. But I don't think it's extraterrestrial life, but it's been taken quite seriously.
When did this come out? Because I remember seeing something like that.
I also remember seeing something
in the last 12 hours. It's been reported.
Oh, no,
wow.
No, I haven't seen it that recently. Because I remember seeing something like this a couple of months ago, and people were very, very excited about it.
I also remember reading
something. But then it turned out it wasn't.
Oh, I see. No, but I think that I think that there's often inferences made, right? The inferences. I mean, they're not proof.
This has just emerged in the last 12 hours or so.
Oh, send us a link, please.
Yes, yeah, please do send the link to the group. That would be great.
The joys of
not alone.
Thank you, Guy. Just to finish that.
There was one comment that came up on the screen was saying, why have we not put out signals of intelligent life? But we actually have.
Yes.
And so our radio signals, that when we broadcasting radio, all of that are considered signals of intelligent life.
Yeah.
If you've ever watched the movie Contact, which is quite an old movie, it's very good, and it shows how aliens find us based on our radio signal.
But we also sent out some probes.
There's also Voyager probes that were sent out. They've now left the solar system
just
some years ago. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
But I think the first one some years ago, and the Voyager 2 just recently, and they have a picture of a man and a woman on a record. I can't remember what's on the record. Does anyone know?
Queen.
Is it
what's that song called? The famous one?
Fat Bottom Girls?
No, that's the famous song. What's the famous song by Queen? Come on.
Bohemian Rhapsody. Anyway, just to draw a line under discussion of aliens, it's worth pointing out that Stephen Hawking's, the very famous British scientist, has highlighted that if we were contacted by alien life, it would probably be a terrible thing. That if they were able to contact us and found us first, they are likely to be more advanced than us. And human history tells us that when more advanced societies meet less advanced, it doesn't work out well for the latter. Anyway, Moving on, we're pressing on to the next lecture, which is amazing water. So we had this evolution of life. We now have life introduced to our model. We had a lecture by someone called Carl. He had long hair, as I remember, and looked like a bit of a hippie. So, but he basically gave a talk where he looked at how water turns out to be the one, or liquid water, in fact, turns out to be the one prerequisite required for life. And so throughout the 60s, scientists believed that there were a whole bunch of prerequisites for life, a whole bunch of factors that you would need to find life somewhere in the universe. And those included it being not too hot, not too cold, not too salty, not too little radiation, not too much radiation, the right pH. There was a whole bunch of different criteria that they thought life needed to meet. But it transpired that through the 70s and 80s, a group of organisms called extremophiles were discovered, and these organisms broke all of those rules from things growing at 110 degrees centigrade to things growing below 0. All of the rules had to go out and the rule book was thrown away. But one thing never appears to have been broken, that all life appears to need access to liquid water. And we examined why that is, what's so special about liquid water. The first, I included the states. We obviously know about 3 states, or 3 well-known states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. And liquid appears to be important because, as Neville talked about in his definition of life, life needs to pass on information from one generation to the next. And to do so in a solid is almost impossible, because a solid has atoms lined up in a regular grid. This atom here never meets this atom here, even though they are only 1 atom apart, which is a tiny, tiny distance. Whereas in a gas, the atoms are spread out and are very random, and that means that the chances of the right atom meeting the other right atom are very slim. Liquids are a happy medium. Information can be passed on in an orderly way, but things move in order to facilitate that passing of information. Why water is more interesting. It turns out that although we're absolutely used to dealing with water in our everyday life, I came to think about it when putting these talks together. Is there really any other liquid that we encounter? Because basically on the periodic table, there isn't a lot that's liquid at room temperature. The only other liquid I can think of is petrol. Mercury? Mercury we don't really encounter, though. I mean, but yeah, petrol I think is about the only. It's not like we really deal with it. We hear it going in the car, and that's it. And so we don't realise that water is actually a completely unique liquid. And that uniqueness all comes back to a chemical quirk, that it's a bent molecule with a positive charged end, a slightly positive charged end, and a slightly negative charged end. Oxygen is what we call electronegative. It steals too many of the electrons. And this little quirk causes a whole plethora of fascinating, completely different from any other liquid. So we have really strange stuff like the solid is less dense than the liquid. That doesn't happen in almost anything else. So ice floats on water and turns out to be essential for life. And it has a high specific heat capacity, so oceans carry more heat. This turns out to be essential for the functioning of the planet. Because it's a non-polar molecule with a slight dipole, it can dissolve both polar molecules and non-polar molecules, giving life access to almost anything it needs in order to make proteins, etc. We could go on and on, but probably the most important is that the dipole in water interacts with the electromagnetic radiation in the microwave and IR region to absorb and vibrate more. And that allows water to be a powerful greenhouse gas, which keeps our planet at the temperatures we need. So that's really why water is so special. We just have a couple of student questions on it. Bongani asks, what would be the consequence if water froze from beneath, i.e. it was denser than the liquid, ice was denser than the liquid? And so very quickly, I'll give mine, and I'll also throw it open. I mean, lakes and oceans would freeze and the ice would sink to the bottom, and that would mean that they weren't insulated. And so as we heard in the Paleoclimates talk from Sweijd, the climate of the Earth goes from cold to hot to glacials to warm to glacials to warm. In those glacial periods, there's a definite possibility that should ice be denser than water, that the whole of the oceans would have frozen. And that would have ended life as we know it. Life would just not be possible. On a more mundane level, if you're drinking a gin and tonic, obviously your ice cubes would sink to the bottom, which would be novel, and they keep the top very warm. Obviously, we would have a very different Arctic. The Antarctic would be the same, but the Arctic, where ice is actually on the oceans, the ice would be on the bottom. So we would have water, I would assume, at the North Pole. My question to anybody who wants to add is, does that mean sea levels would rise?
I'm asking that question.
I'm putting it out there.
The volumes would all be the same.
But does it matter that some of the ice is above the water level?
Yeah, it must. Otherwise, it would displace the water, I imagine.
Guy is shaking his head.
If ice were underwater, that's the question.
Guy, come in.
Go ahead, Guy.
You have to unmute yourself, Guy.
So you're saying if water froze from the bottom?
Yes. If
ice was denser than water,
then the Arctic ice cap would sink to the bottom. But because some of that was above the water level before, would it not raise sea levels?
So the volume of the ice above the water would push the sea level up.
Yes.
Actually, the whole I think it would freeze to the surface. So the whole surface, you wouldn't get any water floating at the surface. You'd get ice. Yeah. And the ocean, the area of liquid ocean would be constricted to areas where the sun could melt water. And so you'd have lakes of water captured within the ice, and those lakes would move seasonally north and south as the Earth wobbles with the seasons. So you'd have a very different sea level.
And probably a very different circulation pattern as well, actually.
The whole climate would be completely different, yeah. Much more extreme.
That's a fascinating thought experiment at any rate. So thank you very much for that one, Garni.
You can get the modelists to try it out. They can simulate that.
Okay, well, I'll put that out there to any Planeteers who are modelers or who become. That's your first job. Let's simulate that and see what happens. I'm not sure what the point is. Asks, is it possible to create water? I suppose at a very simple level, yes, right? I mean, if you burn hydrogen, you make water. In fact, if you burn hydrocarbons, you make water. But the simplest is H2 gas plus O2 in the air will burn to make H2O. You will make water. I mean, you can't create the atoms themselves, but a chemical reaction will do that. There was one question from Nolly on.
Sorry, can I butt in about that water?
Yeah.
There's a guy in the Maculand that sells a powder and makes water. You just have to add water.
Thank you, Guy. There was a question on Twitter from Nolly as to would that be a solution for providing water to South Africa? So, for example, we could just burn hydrogen in order to produce the water we need to address a drought. The issue is, of course, where did you get the hydrogen from? Hydrogen is volatile, which means most of it was lost when the Earth was formed. We have very little in the atmosphere. Most of the hydrogen that we use in the chemical lab or that we would use to burn comes from water. We actually electrolyze water. So you wouldn't actually make yourself any water to solve a drought because you need the water to make the hydrogen to make the water. Nelisiwe asks, looking at chemical ingredients such as water that make the planet habitable, is Earth the only planet with liquid water and no other planets?
As far as we know, yes. There was recently possibility of, they had some observations on Mars and they saw that there might be some water, but they didn't want to send the Curiosity rover to check it out because the Curiosity rover might have some earthly bacteria and they didn't want to contaminate the Mars. They didn't want to even have the possibility of contaminating Mars with our bacteria.
That's interesting. So but Mars definitely has frozen water, right?
Yeah, so I think they were like...
Is that proven or they've got evidence that there was once water there?
I think there was like some, they were not sure. They saw some things that could be water. And then they were like, well, how do we know for sure? And for now, it's not sending the Curiosity rover.
But it has ice caps, right? So there's definitely frozen water.
No.
I want to look that up.
Yeah, I should look that up.
There are obviously planets that have liquid on them, but it might not be liquid water. Right?
Hi. Yes.
Wendy. No, who's it?
It's my turn. But no one gets.
Sorry?
I don't think she intended.
No. Stop beating me when it's my turn now.
Can I just say something quickly, just to hark back? I looked it up just very, very briefly. The Voyager probe that was sent out had on board this golden record, which had greetings from Earth, sounds from Earth, music from Earth, brain waves, and images. Okay, and just as an example, there were 50 pieces or tracks of music, including Bach, Zaire Picnic Girls' initiation song, New Guinea men's housing song, Peru panpipes, Azerbaijan bagpipes, and so on and so forth. And in terms of 55 languages, greetings in 55 languages, and a whole lot of sounds, including music of the spheres, volcanoes, footsteps, heartbeat, laughter, horse and cart, train, an F-11 flyby, Morse code, ships, etc., etc. The whole, you can go look it up if you want to. Very fascinating.
Thank you, Neville. Of course, also not a planet, but a moon is Europa, which they think has liquid water, but not been proven.
Yeah, so there are ice caps on Mars.
Thank you.
And actually, the evidence was that there was. They saw.
So there wasn't ice caps on Mars.
Oh.
There is evidence of. They think it's evidence of flowing water on Mars.
Yes, there's channels that look like.
Yeah, and I think they saw hydrated salts. That's what my quick
research
says.
Sorry, Guy says plants can split and create water. There are ice caps on that's amazing. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and,
I thought it was completely.
And NASA said that it confirmed evidence that liquid water flows on today's Mars.
Wow.
Okay. Nice one. All right. We're going to wrap that up. We're going to move on to the next point. So we've now got life. We're now going to explore life a little bit more and find out some more about it. The first type of life, thematically, we're going to go for the plants and the process of photosynthesis. Basanda, 2 minutes. What can you tell us?
That was going to be 2 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, once more. So when we explore the habitable planet model, we get to a point where we introduce plants. And when we go through that video, the first thing that we talk about is when did plants, come about? And the whole reason why we go there is because we want to highlight that plants actually came about before animals would come on land, and therefore they initiated animal respiration on Earth. So that's the reason why we go there. And then we also talk about plant distributions, and the reason why we talk about plant distribution is because we want to raise the fact that South Africa is very diverse, and the fact that we have a savanna, which initially is hypothesized not to have existed, and we had forests in the place of it. And that, through changes from forest to savanna, that may have encouraged human beings to walk with 2 feet. So we then go on and talk about how these plants evolve over time, because we want to now talk about photosynthesis, which is the actual process. And why we talk about that process is because that is the main process by which oxygen is given off as a byproduct. And of course, oxygen is what gives us life. And therefore, that is the crucial part about plants and habitability of Earth. We also look at a number of experiments just to give a background to the information on photosynthesis, to say that people did, in fact, conduct very simple experiments to bring us to light about photosynthesis. And we also talk about the special South Africa, where we talk about the Cape Forestic region and its diversity. And that is the second part where we highlight the diversity on South Africa's landscape and how that is an important element of habitability. And that is where you get your linking your following talk on diversity, linking it on the current talk of plants and photosynthesis.
Nice one. Thank you, Basanda. So we had quite a lot. It was one of the popular topics to have questions on plants and photosynthesis. Going to start off towards the evolution side of it. The first question, Konanani, are you with us? Are you there, Konanani? Going once, going twice. All right, I'm gonna pass. Konanani was gonna ask her own question. We'll maybe come back to it if we get the chance.
There are some comment questions.
Okay.
Do I need to take those?
Sure.
I'm a bit behind on those. Sorry, everybody. Geez, oh, this actually way back. Let me just see. Okay. How the first cell survived on Earth, adapted to Earth because it's like harsh conditions back then? Well, so the question is, how did the first cell survive? Well, it evolved in that environment, so it was adapted to that particular environment, I guess.
Inhabitable for us, but quite
yes,
good for the first
yes,
cells.
Yes, I mean, there are extremophiles everywhere, right? Animals, I mean, especially bacteria that live, for example, in hydrothermal vents or very acidic conditions where our tissue wouldn't survive, for example. How does that mean? So does it mean that Venus and Mars have oxygen since this is a constituent of life? I'm not sure I follow that. Venus and Mars don't have oxygen. They might have chemical oxygen. Exactly. They don't have free oxygen. Yeah.
That's a really important difference to make. I mean, every planet will have oxygen, but because it's reacted, it will be in minerals in the rocks. It will have already reacted. It's only Earth that appears to have free oxygen in the atmosphere, which is made by life.
So there's no sign of life on Mars, but there's a sign of water on Mars, which is a prerequisite for life. So I hope that there might have been life on Mars, or might even still be.
Yeah, that's all.
Okay. Okay. All right, there's some people answering those questions. What's the Arecibo message? What's that mean? Anyone? Aliens besides us out there in space? Of course, there must be. Carl mentioned that one. What happens in Snowball? I suppose that's Snowball Earth scenario. Yeah. What is Snowball Earth? Guy? Snowball Earth?
One of the theories.
Snowball Earth is thought to have happened a couple of 100 million years ago. CO2 in the atmosphere dropped because carbon was taken up out of the atmosphere. I forget the exact process that reduced the greenhouse effect, and the whole world froze. So there's evidence of this event, and it gradually thawed out again.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. Spade, did you want to add?
Not really, yeah. It's covered.
Okay, fantastic. Anything else, Neville?
That's all. That's, I think, we're up to date.
All right, fantastic. So we're looking firstly, I think we've done quite a lot of the evolution of photosynthesis in the origins of life.
Can I just mention something? I think that's an important point that you made about oxygen, because for most people, when you say there's water and they know that one atom there is oxygen, then they start to say there is oxygen, but often we're talking about freely available atmospheric oxygen.
Okay, thanks, Basanda.
Just a note from Guy.
Carl, there's something really important about the early evolution of photosynthesis.
Blue-green algae. I'm going to mention blue-green algae because you got it here. So you.
Well,
thank you, Neville.
Blue-green algae were the first real, plant type of organisms, and they would tolerate radiation. So they produced all the oxygen that saturated the oxygen sinks and then created oxygen in the atmosphere. But because photosynthesis evolved in low oxygen environments, the enzyme that does photosynthesis is actually sensitive to oxygen today. So as CO2 rises, it counteracts the sensitivity. So with rising CO2, plants become more efficient because they're returning more to the state in which photosynthesis originally evolved, which is quite interesting.
That's really interesting. Yeah, thank you, Guy. Couple of questions linked together. And we see asks, I need clarity on how photosynthesis evolved, and besides oxygen, what other gases were involved? And then Master Shaba asks, the Earth is habitable with a lot of gases. Why is it we need oxygen and a lot of other gases to survive? And Neville, I know we've touched on some bits of that, but do you want to comment on those?
Just rephrase that for me, please.
Rephrase it. So one of them is clarity on how photosynthesis evolved and what other gases are involved besides oxygen. And the other one, why do we need other gases than oxygen to survive on the planet?
Well, again, I think my first answer would be, and I haven't thought about this, would be that life will optimize itself, like most things, within the environment in which it's developed. So we are adapted to a 20% composition, or 18% is it, oxygen in the atmosphere. Nitrogen is an inert gas. It's a very stable gas, so it doesn't really react with anything unless it has a chemical process that's specifically dedicated with catalysts. Other gases are trace gases. I hope I'm answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
Other gases are trace gases. Other gases are active, like methane in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have an effect on both the chemical composition as well as the stereochemistry and the heat balance of the planet. So the gases have direct and indirect effects on life, if you like. And then one other point I wanted to say was that, of course, there are many things in the atmosphere that are not gaseous but are important, such as aerosols, which are particles in the atmosphere. They can have both a cooling effect and a warming effect, or they can have an seeding effect on the creation of clouds, for example. So atmospheric composition is complex, but for life in particular directly, obviously life that depends on oxygen, which of course is by no means all life, is adapted to that particular ratio. That enough information?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
I think it's important to say, though, that the atmosphere is 99.9% nitrogen and oxygen. And the trace gases are a tiny, tiny fraction of the atmosphere. And it's that tiny fraction that changes the energy balance. And that's why we as people can affect the energy balance, because it's such a tiny fraction of the atmosphere that is trace gases that we affect.
Nice one. Thank you, Guy. I want to move on from the evolution of photosynthesis to actually kind of investigating the process itself. We had Kumbuzile ask, is it correct to consider the breaking down of water through the action of light as the basis of photosynthesis? Guy, do you want to field that?
Yeah, that's correct. Plants have found an efficient way of capturing the energy from photons in a certain wavelength and converting that into chemical energy, which splits water, which is then frees up energy to be used to create carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal process. Incredibly complex. It's hard to imagine how it evolved, but it must have. And it's one of those magical things about life. Is you have this incredible process which involves different pigments in the plant cell, which capture different wavelengths, and they funnel them down to a reaction center. And that energy, when it's funneled into the reaction center, splits water and takes an electron and turns it into a carbohydrate. Isn't it amazing?
Guy, do you off the top of your head know how efficient it is, the quantum efficiency?
Oh, it's very inefficient. It's you know, it's in the 1 or 2%, less than 5%.
But the last time I looked, it's still about 10 times better than solar panels, right?
I don't think so.
Oh, really?
Efficiency defined in what terms? The amount of energy going in with the amount of energy created, stored energy created.
Exactly. But when I did my undergraduate degree, the difference was 10 times to solar panels. But I guess solar panels have got a lot more efficient. But I would be really surprised if the humans had got better than nature.
Well, I'd have to go and look at it just to see what, how you define efficiency. Is it efficiency per unit surface area of the leaf? Or per number of cells or per area of soil? It's quite a tricky question, actually. But quite a nice one for students to follow up on. I might be getting the efficiency of photosynthesis wrong, but I don't think it's that efficient.
Okay.
A question, a tweeted question, but this pertains to something earlier, so you have discretion, Carl, as to whether we address it or not. And the question is from Anelisiwe Nyanaluvane, who asks, may Dr. Carl explain if the virus is dead or alive? Thank you for the question. I don't know if we have time to tackle it now. If you want to get to it later,
I'll do it very quickly. I would definitely say alive, because a virus has behavior which, for me, is obviously different from, for example, a rock. I mean, it increases entropy. It's able to reproduce. It does things that. And it's difficult to characterize it, but for me, it does things that are characteristically definitely different from inanimate objects which are not alive. It is part of the biological world. It uses biological molecules. It passes on genetic information. The fact that it can't do that without a host is, for me, neither here nor there. I mean, we can't live without plants. That doesn't mean that we're not alive. But anyway.
And my counter argument, very briefly, is simply that a virus, if you look at the structure of a virus itself, what is a virus made of? It has nothing other than a piece of RNA or DNA, depending on what kind of virus it is, who codes only for the reproduction of that piece of DNA itself and the piece of material that covers it. That's all it does. So it is effectively a genetic accident, right? It's a piece of genetic accident which is designed or evolved to hijack the metabolism of its host in order to reproduce itself.
But you've just used the word evolved. You've just said it evolved. Do non-living things evolve?
Absolutely. Well, if they don't, I have an argument. So the question is...
I think it just shows how, nature doesn't fit into boxes. We like to put things in boxes. Indeed. And sometimes, nature doesn't fit our boxes, and it makes us feel uncomfortable. We should be quite happy to be uncomfortable.
I have to say,
I was going to jump on a genetic accidents because a lot of evolution is actually bad. It's just, something weird happened and then it worked.
You guys at home might be able to get the impression that whether the viruses are alive is a discussion Neville and I have had in the office several times.
I just want to say one more thing about viruses, because they're such fascinating organisms. Sorry, I said organisms. They're such fascinating entities. So you might know one of the theories of cancer, one of the types of cancers are caused by something called oncogenes. And oncogenes are thought, at least one theory, actually ancient viral infections, which exist in our DNA, replicates with us, is dormant in our body, and the carcinogens actually promote the reproduction of the genetic, or at least the translation and the expression of those oncogenes, which make the cell go nuts and become cancerous. Furthermore, we have in our body things called pseudogenes. And pseudogenes are, again, I don't have time to explain the details, are replicas of real genes, but they're not functional. And the theory of those, so in other words, you might have a gene for, say, saliva, for the protein salivary amylase, but that particular gene is non-functional. It recurs in our DNA, but it's not functional because it's missing bits. And the reason is that the RNA virus, which retranscribes DNA from its RNA, that enzyme it produces, has also caused some of our RNA to be made back into DNA and spliced in the wrong place into our genome. And so we carry this gene which is non-functional. And that's called a pseudogene. And the bottom line there is that our DNA is about 90% nonsense, actually. I forget what the exact statistic is, but way more nonsensical. And a lot of that is ascribed to to viral interactions. So there it is.
Thank you for that interlude. Coming back to the topic at hand, photosynthesis, if we may. I've got two questions which...
When you're coming back to photosynthesis, there's a point that I wanted to make about what Guy was saying. I think that photosynthesis is not efficient to the extent that the amount of energy that the plant needs to pull up water, and that in the process of taking in carbon dioxide, much of that water can get lost, in fact. To that extent, it's not efficient, but to the extent that it is able to capture the energy from the sun and store it and use it at the same time, it's quite efficient.
We could go down the whole road of why are leaves green and not black, but we must press on.
A question for Basanda. I'm not sure if this is directly relevant to what you're saying, but maybe you can answer it. How does deforestation for farming affect have an effect O2? I assume it's O2 levels. And also another question is, no, it's oxygen actually. And the next question is water oxidized or reduced during photosynthesis? I wouldn't know the answer to that.
What was the first question about?
First question is basically, does deforestation, which might be done in order to create land for farming, have an effect on oxygen availability? In other words, does it affect oxygen cycle, oxygen biogeochemical balance? I think this is...
It would have to happen in a huge extent. I mean, in one farm, it would be insignificant.
Okay. And you're replacing one plant with another plant, which is also photosynthetic, so the balance... Forests have other functions.
No, but guys, remember that the CO2 level in the atmosphere is 0.035%. Oxygen concentration is 18%.
Guy, just to say, the carbon dioxide is 0.04 now, right? We're permanently above that.
I'm sorry, 0.04. I'm showing my age. It's 0.04%. And oxygen is 18%. So you could wipe out all the Earth's forests, and you'd make no difference to the oxygen level. You'd have a huge effect on the CO2 concentration, but you'd have no effect on oxygen whatsoever. All the heavy lifting on oxygen was done by the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, 300 million years ago.
Okay, thanks. I have to press on, guys. And with that, I had two questions which I think lead into each other, which I'm going to ask you to answer, Guy. The first one is from Sinan Shlanchla, who asks, why is C3 photosynthesis the most important out of all the types? And then Love Nolly from Twitter asks, is there an optimum temperature for photosynthesis? And if so, will a warmer climate improve or inhibit productivity?
Yeah, two brilliant questions there. C3 photosynthesis is still the most important because it evolved under relatively high CO2. And for most of the Earth's history, CO2 has been high. And by high, I mean well above 500 parts per million, closer to 2,000 to 3,000 parts per million. We're now 1/10 of that. So the more advanced forms of photosynthesis, which are called crassulacean acid metabolism and C4 photosynthesis, are thought to have evolved much more recently in the last sort of 10 to 50 million years as CO2 levels started to drop. And both those forms of photosynthesis are much more efficient at harvesting CO2 as CO2 drops. You can put a C4 plant in a closed jar and illuminate it, and it will suck all the CO2 out of the atmosphere. A C3 plant can't do that. So they're less. The C4 plants are expanding rapidly. They've expanded from about 10 million years ago, and they've evolved, diversified, and expanded rapidly, as have CAN plants. But now that we're turning the CO2 concentration around, it looks as though their evolution is under threat. And if we keep pushing CO2 up and it irrevocably goes high, one would hypothesize that C4 grasslands could even disappear as the world turns back into a forest. We know that when CO2 was very high, the world was a forest. So that's a great question. So photosynthesis does have an optimum. It varies from plant to plant. But it's anywhere between 5 and 35 degrees C. You'll get depending on the plant's metabolism, you'll get an optimum. So as temperatures rise, plants that are better adapted to higher temperatures become favored. And that's one of the mechanisms behind biodiversity loss and turnover as the Earth's temperatures will rise. So we will see the rise of plants that are good at under high CO2 and under warm climates, which are tropical forests.
Nice one. Thank you very much, Guy.
So when it comes to importance, then that much all the maize that we eat and much of the stuff that we use as C4. So if you look at much of the C3s, except for those that are trees, they're not much use to us. So in that importance, I want to understand that importance.
Okay. You want to ask that as a question?
Yeah, no, I mean from Guy, he said that C3s are more important. So I'm saying from the extent that we use as human beings, so in our habitability of Earth, C4s are more important to us.
Guy, you want to respond?
C4, look, yeah, I mean the world's food economy is driven fundamentally on C4 cereal crops, which actually aren't very good for us, actually, to the bottom line. Because we didn't evolve, we evolved under low CO2 conditions. So we're a species that probably wouldn't have been able to eat a lot of carbohydrate in the natural environment for much of our evolutionary history, because it just wasn't. The CO2 level was less than 200 parts per million. So we would have been fundamentally meat eaters and seafood eaters with a little bit of carbohydrate smattering here and there, except for a lucky discovery of honey in a beehive, which is why bees protect their honey so well. They would have been under a lot of pressure in low CO2 environments. So yeah, we now depend on C4 cereal crops. They're not good for us. They cause obesity. They cause all sorts of problems. But it's a cheap way to produce lots of carbohydrate. And that's how the world runs at the moment. It's going to be interesting to see. But we can keep crops going by plowing and adding fertilizer. So we'll keep our C4 crops growing. It's the natural C4s that are going to start dropping out.
There was a question about bees.
Hello?
Hi, you have a question?
Yes, I do have a question based on Basanda's question posed on Guy, saying that C4 is more important. We are talking about keeping the Earth habitable. If we argue that C4 is more important because it is our main food source, the main subclass is our main food source right now, how much weight does that argument carry? Because we still need to keep Earth habitable. Us preferring to rely more on the C4 plants, where does the habitability of planet Earth stand then?
Sorry, can you say that last bit again, Spay? We missed it.
Yeah, I'm saying, how do we argue in terms of importance? How do we argue that C4 is more important? That argument is based on us consuming the C4 plants. Where do we put Earth? Where do we put the habitability of Earth? Are we not perpetuating climate change? And I think it could also go back to the question of agriculture, deforestation for agriculture. So we now will deforest because we need to plant more C4 because we need C4. What about Earth? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that was put forth to say that to me, none of the two is more important than the other, because even the structure of savanna would be supported by, somewhat a delicate balance of the two. And the savanna structure is quite important in itself. So even if you took out all the trees and left all the grasses, that would not be important alone. It was not to say that C4s are more important, but if a person says C3s are more important, then I would bring an argument to say C4s would be more important.
Can I add to that? I mean, I think...
I'd also just point out that savannas are currently converting from open woodlands into forests over vast areas of South Africa because of rising CO2. We've got very good evidence for that over the last 40 years.
Okay, thanks, Guy. Raissa?
So what I wanted to add is, with climate change, the planet eventually will be fine. It's us who are going to have a problem. And when we discuss the environment, a lot of it actually has to do, what can the environment do for us and how do we keep it doing that? I think that's one of the big points. The planet things will change, but
Yes.
it won't be there.
Well, yes. 2 questions. So I'm compelled to respond just to say that indeed there's been lots and lots and lots and lots of life, and we've only just arrived. And if we go, life will continue. Khalid Mather. I think what Sife is trying to say is that some companies will use C4's economic importance as a driver to make more agricultural plots. Meanwhile, CAM and C3 plants will be marginalized as we will make plants more planet more C4 friendly. That's the comment. But we were talking about, yeah, I mean, yes, okay, well, we can get into sort of like the political economy of food. That's another whole.
We can do that next time.
Yeah.
So we get onto humans. Lloyd makes the observation that if you take a given ecosystem, the leaf structure, the structure of leaves in that system tends to be similar. So deserts have lots of spiny leaves. Out here, looking in Cape Town, we have lots of wide, flat leaves. He asks, why do we think all the leaves look the same in a specific habitat? And how does leaf structure affect the rate of photosynthesis? Fabian, are you with us? Do you want to come in there? Zulu, Fabian, are you there?
See your face, can't hear your voice.
We could hear him earlier, right?
Yeah. Well, he's busy plugging in.
Yeah, we can.
There he goes. Yes. You're up.
Yes. No, I have to connect this to be able to talk to the panel. And now they were asking, one of the first questions they was asking, why are all the leaves look so the same? And then the good example, I thought I was going to take Carl and use Carl as an experiment. And then say, okay, if Carl was to stand in the Palo and you get a human being from North America, South America, North, South, East Africa, is there any way you're going to tell me that you don't, can you misidentify a human being? So we all human beings. There's no way our Carl is going to call a human being a cow. So that's exactly what I'm saying. As long as they are leaves and they're classified under the kingdom plant, they will have a common characteristics because they have a common need. But the difference, Carl will be able to, if I were to ask Carl, how different are these people? You would find out that one person from West Africa, where there is a lot of sun, will have more melanin to be able to adapt, and so on and so forth. So if you put that together, you start looking at leaves, you would find out that leaves from different areas will adapt. For example, leaves in the desert will they will be more fleshy, and they would to reduce the amount of light water that is going to be lost from the leaves. Those from areas that are prone to be eaten by animals will have thorns and will have some kind of adaptation. But at the same time, these leaves will then have the different characteristics that will be able to absorb energy and use CO2 with the chlorophyll nature. So that's why they are always common. Most often, all leaves are almost like green. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Fabian. Anybody else want to comment on that? No? Okay. And going once, going twice.
Oh, no, I was sorry, I was coming in. Yeah, I mean,
you're there, guy.
It looks superficially like the same environments in different parts of the world select for the same structure and function in plants. And there's some evidence for that, but there's also a lot of variation. So if you go to environments in Australia, you'll find very different sorts of trees in the savanna, the eucalyptus trees versus an African savanna looks completely different. So there's an evolutionary history that's also involved, and it's related to the kind of animals. Australia has marsupials, Africa has ungulate mammals. So that's, things diverge, and life is incredibly creative in finding solutions. So you get divergence within this apparent convergence.
Just wanted to add something that you're all considering plants as exclusively terrestrial. Of course, they are not, right? And there are marine algae, all kinds, from microalgae to macroalgae to macrophytes, and they have a range of different pigment colors, brown, red, and green algae superficially, but even within those, there's a huge range of different photosynthetic pigments, and that's important because they can photosynthesize at different wavelengths of light. And that has another...
Yes, and you can use those pigments to identify the different species of phytoplankton.
Correct, indeed.
Perfect.
So I just want to mention that.
Thank you for bringing...
Was there part on leaf structure? And also leaf structure can help because if, for example, a leaf is more expanded, there's a greater leaf area, that means it's got a bigger surface to capture light. And at times during the day, plants will tilt their leaves to minimize light capture, to avoid photoimitation, because then if they get bombarded by the light, then the temperatures override. So, I mean, the structure can also help a plant a lot to minimize or to increase the rate of photosynthesis.
Nice one, thanks, Basanda.
Just reminds me to say that, of course, most photosynthesis on the planet happens at sea with diatoms, right? And with microalgae.
Which is great, because that brings us nicely on to the next question. And Tombi asks, why is it that in photosynthesis at sea, most of it appears to happen around the coasts?
Well, in 2 words, that's just because there's more nutrients around the coast. Nutrients can come from rivers, can come from, on the west coast of continents, there's cold water that's being brought up because of the wind. And that cold water has actually a lot of nutrients because it's coming from the bottom of the ocean. And because there's lots of food for them, the phytoplankton just gorge out and grow. That's it.
Just to call in again. So if you look at satellite images using color, one of the Access emblems has got it somewhere. You use ocean color as a measurement of photosynthesis, as you pointed out, especially like you can see in Africa, the Congo River, big plume of productivity because of the nutrients, as you correctly point out. And the oceans are highly limited in their productivity by certain nutrients, in particular iron, right?
So iron is a big one, especially in the Southern Ocean.
Yes.
The central ocean gyres, so the middle of the ocean, the North Atlantic, and is often limited by nitrogen. Depending, the upwelling systems are generally not limited. So depending on different regions, what limits phytoplankton growth actually differs.
Right.
So sometimes nitrogen, it can be over geological scales, it's actually phosphorus.
Right.
So yeah, it does depend.
Okay. There's more to say.
Yeah, there's a lot more to say about it.
Konanani, are you with us and can you talk?
We have a new tweet. Loving the snacks at NNMU.
Can you talk, Konanani?
I wonder if they're having vanilla.
Yes,
Why
I'm
would I say
connected
that?
now.
Hey, fantastic. Your question was on photosynthesis. Did you get your question answered? Are you happy so far?
Yes, I'm very happy.
No questions to ask? Putting you on the spot.
Well, I was disconnected when my question was answered, I think.
Okay. So you're all happy?
Yeah.
All right, then I'm going to press on. The next topic is biodiversity. We were supposed to have a summary by Thando, but I see that she's having connectivity issues. But luckily, we have the expert on giving the biodiversity talk next to me. Rendani, can you give us 2 minutes how biodiversity contributes to a habitable planet?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe less than 2 minutes. You will remember that biodiversity is...
Sorry, carry on.
You remember that when we talk about biodiversity, we talk about a wide range of different, forms of life on planet Earth. We talk about microorganisms, fauna and flora. And also biodiversity play a very significant role, to humans. If you think of ecosystem services, we get free biodiversity. And there are quite a number of threats that as humans. And there are quite a number of So if you think of human-induced climate change, also contributing to issues such as coral reef bleaching, etc., etc.
Okay, nice one. Thank you, Rendani. Thando, you just missed your slot, but you look like you're with us. Do you have something to add? Don't forget to unmute yourself. It's at the top of the screen. It's at the top of the screen.
Can you please mute?
Okay, Thandolwethu. Okay, Thandolwethu. We're listening to you.
Am I unmuted? So sorry, my connection is really bad. Oh, yes. Okay, great. Oh, yes. What I wanted to add was the importance of biodiversity in the habitability of Earth. Biodiversity, it boosts the ecosystem productivity, basically in our planet, where every organism, no matter how small, they play a very crucial role in sustaining the natural sustainability of all the life forms. So no matter how small an organism it is very important in the ecosystem. And also that a great example would be the recent talks about totally eradicating mosquitoes because of the Zika virus, but that could have major impacts that haven't been outlined so far. So biodiversity is very important because, first of all, we are dependent on the ecosystem services that it offers for our survival and the survival of all the other living beings. Yeah.
Okay, nice one. Thank you, Tando.
Okay, nice one. Thank you, Tando.
There's some controversy. Well, it's a quick question. Okay, thank you, Tando. So there's some controversy in your talk. Bulelwa and Sami Kaliswe both suggest that you only mention 7 biomes when actually there are 9. They say, why are the Indian Ocean belt and desert biome not considered?
First of all, well, there are 7 major biomes in South Africa. The Indian coastal belt, which spans around KZN, falls through the thicket biome here in KZN. So it's not necessarily a biome. It's a sub-biome. I don't know if that's the correct term, but that's how I'd put it, because we only have the 7 major biomes.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes they have got 8, have got 9, but I stick with the 9 biomes because you've got the one that she has mentioned. It is included in some literature where some scientists do concur that it is part of those biomes.
Okay, interesting. Thanks.
And just how people map vegetation often is that they map what they can pick up. So if people can pick up more detail, then they'll map up more detail. And if their resolution is more coarse, then they will map that. But I think what is important is that if you want to go finer, you can go beyond the 7 biomes, which are major. But if you are happy with that, then that's good.
But it all depends on definition,
and
right?
this brings us back to this point of we like putting things in boxes, but it doesn't always fit, and also like the tools that you use and how you do it defines how you classify things.
And a nice example is one of Gauteng, that previously when Gauteng was mapped, it was without a doubt that it was all grasslands. But if you look at the recent maps now, you can really see bush being mapped even, whereas initially it was not mapped. And the question is it really still all grassland? No. So it's just about the detail that you go to.
Perfect. Thanks, guys.
Just a little catch up on conversation on the chat line. Is just some conversation about let's just see. There's this plant called Portulacaria afra, which converts CO2 quite efficiently, or captures CO2 quite efficiently. So there are farms, if you like, they're farming CO2. I don't know much about it. They're very succulent. Maybe some other people here know about it. And then there was a question about what makes the Cape Floristic Kingdom the one of the World Heritage Sites, which we can answer. And there was something about iron in the oceans that I saw, but I can't seem to find it now.
Okay, we'll come back.
Okay.
I want to go to a question from Mardi, and I think it's a really great question. First, it really embodies our reductionist approach. You know, we've had this kind of like trying to reduce the Earth to its bare essentials and try and see what the effect of each layer is and you know, we add a layer at a time. And so we're adding biodiversity rather than just one species, right? I mean, because actually we've seen that climate changes happen, and to be resilient to climate changes, you need more than one species. The more complex the ecosystem, the more resilient it is. Mardi asks, and I don't know how we're going to go about answering it, and I'll come to that, but she asks, what's the minimum biodiversity required for life to continue on Earth? And so it's a real reductionist question. What is it the minimum we would be able to get away with? And given it's almost an impossible question, I'm going to hand it over to our only Nobel Prize winner, in Guy.
I think that's a fantastic question. What's the minimum number of species? Well, I guess it's probably about 5 or 6. You need a fungus, you know, you need an algae, a marine alga, a fish, and a mammal, and a plant. And I think you could build a very, very simple system that would persist, and we know this because you can build, you know, models of biological systems that will persist. Of course, be vulnerable to, for example, an infection, and it would be metastable because things would immediately start evolving, and without in not too much time, a few thousand or 100,000s of years, those few species would evolve into many, many more.
But so terraniums
solution, you can't stop it.
I mean, aquaria and terrania are closed systems, which are feudal.
Guy, can I question, why would you need a fish?
I think you need something to keep algae from getting out of control and depleting oxygen in the atmosphere. I don't know. You need where you have a producer, you need a consumer. I mean, I'm just sort of thinking off the top of my head. If you just have producers without having consumers, you may the producers just run away and consume all the oxygen, or no, actually maybe that's not right. Oh, I've got to think it through. You know, it'd be quite fun to try and run that experiment and figure out how it would work. Not sure.
When I was younger, I actually had a computer game which modeled exactly this. It was called Sim Life, and you had to try and set up ecosystems that worked. So it's definitely something that people have tried to model. Neville, you had a question on that?
There was a question here, just simply, which I don't know the reference. Please, can we get the reference of the biome numbers? So did you say there were 7 biomes or something like that?
Musina and Rutherford. What Musina and Rutherford? Yeah, there's you can get conduct SANBI. We have it. You can download it.
Did you mention an author's name?
Yeah.
So again, Musina and
Rutherford.
Rutherford.
Mike Rutherford, not sure Muchina. But the original biome work was done by Rutherford and Westphal back in 1984. Biomes of Southern Africa, and they just had 7 biomes. And
I think we just cited that in our seasonal cycles paper. It's coming out in a paper we're producing and about the different biomes. And just quickly to catch up again, there was a point here about the CO2 capturing plants that are grown for that purpose. And then the comment was, well, in connection with iron fertilization of the oceans, that's one way of sort of geoengineering carbon dioxide. But actually, quite coincidentally, today I had a conversation about a side event that's going to take place, hopefully, at the Global Change Conference, which I'm all sure you're going to. And at that conference, the side event is to start a conversation about aerosol shading of the atmosphere. So to pump sulfates, I believe it is, into the atmosphere to shade the earth, basically to create more albedo. And that's like apparently the most effective way, given that we can't control CO2 and won't control CO2, what can we engineer? And that's one of the geoengineering stories.
Well, in terms of answering the iron geoengineering, the problem is we don't actually know exactly how it works. So if you're going to put iron in the ocean, you need to put it at exactly the right time, when there's exactly the right species, when there's exactly the right amount of light for this to work. And then the other issue is that if you make a whole lot of organic matter, that organic matter decomposes and might actually produce bacteria that make methane, that make N2O, and those are actually greenhouse gases that would make the problem worse. So it's a very, very difficult thing to go and mess with.
You guys are jumping ahead now. This is biogeochemical science.
Okay. All I want to say there is that there are a whole lot of, as you say, unanticipated, unknown unknowns.
And I think
we just don't know what we'll be doing.
I guess we'll answer all those questions a bit later.
You'll have a chance. So I'm gonna push on in biodiversity, just to say that whatever Guy's number is of the minimum number of species that's needed.
We'll just say one, because then we could just come up with very clever ways of making everything industrially.
I mean,
I'm being very controversial.
I mean, originally, right, there must have been just one species, the first species, and they survived, presumably, because we're here to prove it. But let's assume for now that actually we don't want to find out how the minimal number of species is, that we would like to conserve them. Let's move on to thinking about ways of doing so. I want to start with Lwandle on Twitter again, because it's a cute question, which if Thando, if you're there, I'm going to put to you, is she asks, how does dressing up penguins in jerseys help during oil spills? Does it keep them warm, or does it make them oil-proof?
Well, it does not make them oil-proof, but it keeps them warm, because the problem with oil spills is that whenever there's an oil spill, the oil lands on the penguins' feathers, then they can't conduct heat and they can't keep warm, therefore they end up dying off. So those little jerseys are meant to help keep them warm, so they can get them cleaned up, rehabilitated, and then released back into the ocean.
Question: Why are penguins particularly susceptible to oil spills?
Pardon me?
Why are penguins?
Yeah.
Gannets, South Africa, particularly susceptible during oil spills.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't get the question.
I'll try one more time. The question is.
You need to mute.
You need to mute.
Yeah,
so the question is, why are penguins, in particular, and also gannets, as it happens, susceptible during oil spills? Like, what is it about those two species, those two birds, that make them susceptible to other seabirds?
Now unmute.
Yes. I'm not sure how to answer that. Well, I don't know the answer to that. Can I please have help from the panel? But I would have guessed that it has something to do with their feathers.
Isn't it just the fact that the oil washes up?
Hang on, Guy. Thando, can you mute?
Oh.
I think Raissa has an answer.
Okay. Okay, we'll go to Raissa first, then Guy.
I was just going to say that maybe we're paying more attention to them. That generally it's the birds that are living closer to the surface, maybe that would be quite affected by the oil spills. But everyone likes penguins, so you don't worry about seagulls. You worry about the penguins.
Guy. Guy, you're muted.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, I think it's because oil washes up in their environment, and they're relatively rare in this part of the world. So there is a higher value associated with them. But we also wash other birds who are affected, like cormorants and others. It's not only restricted to penguins. But that environment is very, very susceptible to oil spills, that coastal, as birds live.
Are we muted? Unmuted.
No.
I just wanted to add that a lot of it also got to do with their behavior. So what gannets do is they forage offshore, and they're flying high and they're looking down for fish, and they see the glimmer, and they assume that the glimmer is in fact fish breaking the surface. They dive into the oil.
Yes. Yeah, it's so unlikely. It's just because we are aware of the oil.
Yes.
Okay, nice one. And Nkwele asks, what influences alien species to evolve, and what process leads to distribute them?
Ask that again.
What influences invasive alien species to evolve, or which processes lead to the distribution of them? Tando, I'm going to give you it. I'm going to turn my mic off. Now.
Yes. Alien invasive species, I don't think they necessarily evolve because that would take a longer period. But I'd say that maybe in that space of time when they're introduced into a new area, what would influence them to adapt is competition between them and other alien invasive species, or the competition between them and indigenous species. And also would be for them to adapt to the environmental conditions in that particular area, the area where they've been introduced and they're trying to reproduce. Because compared to indigenous plants or species, alien invasives tend to be more aggressive, and their growth is very fast and they reproduce quickly. So I'm guessing that would influence alien invasives to evolve so that they use most of the space that's available in the area so that they can reproduce and be successful, yes, in the ecosystem. Moving on to the second part, the processes which lead into their distribution. Well, I don't know if alien invasives are favored by animal dispersal mechanisms, but I would say that the processes that would lead to the distribution would be, maybe let's say globally, it would be because of globalization, because we have alien invasives from overseas, which may have come through South Africa through cargo in the ocean. And also another process that would lead to their distribution would be that some indigenous animal species would enjoy eating alien invasive plants, and therefore they transport them to other areas, and therefore they spread and they really become uncontrollable.
Nice one.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think another thing was people introduce animals as pets in different places. So, for example, I know that in Mauritius, where I'm from, we now have a Madagascan gecko. And that's because they're like really big, colorful geckos that people have brought as pets. Same with the Indian miners that get brought in, and with plants as well. Oh, here's a pretty plant, I'm going to take this to my country.
I think also another important thing that is often like taken to a new area that doesn't have natural enemies, and then they tend to do well because, you know, nothing, maybe you can take in eucalyptus, there's no bush baby, or there's no this, that kaola, or that eats it, so it tends to be happy and do well. But also it can now get introduced to new enemies that may use it in a different way, but not necessarily affect it, but then push it to evolve. Like I saw the other time an invasive species from America that was borrowed by this an insect in the root, and it would have this gall, but the plant would do well above ground. It would survive and continue as if nothing happened, you know. So that is one thing that can also push them to evolve and do well. Nice one.
Okay, Neville, quickly.
Sorry, I have to talk about ballast water. It's just a good example. So what happens is you get a lot of marine organisms that get transferred from one port to another by virtue of shipping. So the way it works is that if a ship can't go across the ocean empty, so if the ship is traveling from port A to port B, if it doesn't have cargo in it, it has to have water in the ballast tanks to give the ship some, otherwise the ship will snap. So They fill up their ballast tanks when the ship is empty in port A. They travel across the ocean. When they fill it up, they pump with big, thick pumps. They'll pump everything in, all the microorganisms and the larvae and everything else like that. Go to port B, load up. As they're loading up with the cargo, they're pumping out the water, which comes from an alien port, into this new environment. And so all the alien species, and huge environmental things. So there's a whole program now about water exchange at sea and treating the water and all different kinds of things to try and stop that from happening. It's called the Ballast Water Program.
Yes.
My favorite story of an invasive species, and I don't know if somebody can fill in the details, I can't remember, but I know that there was a species of flightless birds that was wiped out before it was even characterized by science by one cat. There was a small island with a lighthouse, and the lighthouse keeper brought a cat. One cat made an entire species extinct within a few weeks, I think. It was quite impressive.
Yeah, and I mean, rats on ships. That was also back in the day.
I'm sorry, I have another anecdote I have to share. So South Africa has research stations on Gough Island and on Marion Island, and they took cats.
Yeah.
A pair of cats, male and female.
No, so the story I heard is that the one group of people went with male cats only. Because they're like, no, the cats won't reproduce. And then that was fine. And then the next group went and they brought only female cats. Okay. And that's now
so the cat population spread and started attacking the albatrosses, right? And the albatross chicks. So they had to try and get rid of these cats.
Those cats were vicious.
They became feral, right? So what they did was they tried cat flu, they tried trapping them, and eventually they sent a team of sharpshooters, and they actually shot them all, every single one.
They sent dogs, and the dogs would come out and their eyes gorged out.
So
those cats were
good story.
Moving on from
Neville, on Marion Island, the mice have gone crazy, the invasive mice, and the mice are now eating the birds. Because they've eaten everything else.
Bring back the cats, I say.
Yeah, rats can be a big problem.
It's like the little old lady who swallowed the fly. Well, I've got you, Guy. The next question is from Lawrence. Very quickly, because we're pressed for time. What would you say is the biggest challenge for biodiversity science right now?
Proving that biodiversity matters.
Very good answer. And that's brilliantly quick. Thank you.
Is it not a taxonomic problem? A taxonomic challenge?
Oh, Neville, you just have to make it longer. All right.
He can just say no.
Yeah, he did. He just said no. So that's fine. And lastly, a really interesting question. Zwelile asks, how can the notion of conservation be instilled among people, mainly those in rural areas, who depend upon degrading or disturbing natural environments for their survival? Spey, you want to take this?
Yes, hello?
Yes.
Yeah, Guy sort of paved the way for me in saying that proving that biodiversity matters is a problem. But before I answer the question, I just want to state that, firstly, this notion of the rural people being the most degrading to nature is false, actually, because when you come to think of it, the idea of nature conservation came through Western ways of utilizing nature. When, for example, in South African colonization, when the area was colonized, people were living in harmony with nature in rural areas. The indigenous people were living in harmony with nature. They knew when to hunt, they knew when to fish, they knew when not to. And then there was I'll call it recreational hunting, sports hunting, and those kind of activities. Those are what pushed species to extend, not necessarily extinction, but they drove a lot of biodiversity loss. And then in terms of getting people from rural areas to understand the importance, before we get to that, these people do not rely on disturbing nature per se. They do live in harmony with nature, and then their livelihoods were sustainable, but we are losing resources at a faster rate. So it now looks like them using these resources, they are exploiting nature, which is not really the case. But to get them involved in nature conservation and understanding the value of biodiversity, I think the key approach is what you call community-based conservation, or community-based approaches to nature conservation. Get the people involved in nature conservation. Don't just shut them out and maybe call in an environmentalist who's going to go there, preach to them, biodiversity is important. You can't farm here because there's this tree which is endemic and things like that. Then people won't be easy for them to digest that idea. Whereas if you get them involved, tell them how they are making a loss by degrading nature, make them understand the value of biodiversity and how if they utilize it in different ways, it could help them in the long run and it can be sustained for a longer time. I think the key is just getting them to do the conserving rather than fencing them out of protected or nature conservation areas. Thank you.
Neville?
Just want to say a couple of things. There's some catch up to do on the comment line. First question was, why do polar bears not eat penguins? But I think they do.
They don't.
They don't because they live on different.
Completely
yeah, of course.
ways they possibly could.
Actually, I was going to say that, but I wasn't sure.
But in a zoo.
So the answer is polarization. Get it? Polarization. Okay, and then the other question that comes was shoot the mice. And then how do we measure, this is a serious question, Dr. Midgley, how do we measure the threshold number of invasive species in the country? How much is, I guess, enough? How much is too many? And then how's this for an argument? They found cancer-combating cells in the milk of Tasmanian devils. If they were wiped out, we would never know that. That's interesting. That's it, I believe.
Do you want to pose that previous question to Guy?
The question was really, what is the kind of, I'm going to combine this with an earlier question right at the beginning, even before we started. So what's the issue around invasive species? And this is a Center for Invasive Biology at Stellenbosch. But the question is, I guess, how much is like a problem, or how much is too much, and how much is tolerable of alien invasive species? Is there an answer to that, like sort of a metric?
Well, I mean, there's a purist answer, and there's a pragmatic answer, and there's a devil-may-care answer, which is doesn't matter. Just let the system evolve. It's happened time and time again. Moving on the planet, completely unprecedented. So we see more interesting ecological things happening. Etc. Can do away.
Guy, you're breaking up.
Guy, we're gonna have to come back to you. Sorry. Wendy, are you there? Did you have a question or a comment? See if we can get Wendy.
What happened to the pigs to eat everything? Yeah?
Wendy, are you there?
Yeah.
You had a comment.
I just sent it on the group chat. Or should I?
Yeah, well, we can't see it, so read it out.
What was the question?
The question was about the notion of involving people in the rural areas and participating in nature conservation.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can also implement indigenous knowledge systems that have actually been developed over years and years and passed on over generations, because people in the rurals, like Siphelele already mentioned, have been living in harmony, like utilizing resources in a reasonable manner. So they actually have indigenous knowledge, which can actually help nature conservation to carry on in a normal way, I guess. Yeah, that's all.
All right, thank you, Wendy.
One question I was wondering is how much knowledge we've lost. You know, if people are not passing on the knowledge from generation to generation, how much knowledge is lost, and what can we do about this?
Mm-hmm. It's all really interesting points. If we had time, I would absolutely dispute the premise in both of those that pre-industrial societies lived in harmony with nature.
Yeah, but
there's a lot of evidence that actually per unit person and unit energy, they were much more destructive. It's just that there were more people and more energy.
That's another point I was going to that I've got that written down here. Is population growth is
absolutely
is a big problem.
I mean, a great example is Easter Island, right? That was pre-industrial, but they killed themselves. That's the whole island died because they used up all of the resources. Without using any modern, they were pre-industrial, everything got used up, they all died.
I can carry on commenting unless you want to move on, Carl.
I want to move on to the next topic, but in between topics is a good time if there's...
Just because somebody, in fact, who's listening to us from Scotland, in the form of Monique.
International audience.
Who I was recently with in Namibia, reminded me of the Namibian conservancies, which I want to talk about briefly. These are complicated things, but what they've done is try to compromise between conservation and, if you like, agricultural utilization of land, and develop what are called conservancies. So the land actually belongs to the Ministry of Environmental Affairs, but people live on it and they do subsistence agriculture on it. And there are wild animals that live among the people. So it works quite well as a system. But it has political complications, because often it was done to take land out of the agricultural department so that it couldn't be repossessed, basically, by government. So that's another complexity in the story. But those are interesting systems. And there are also development questions, which will come later in the course, but development questions about what's right for development. Should people be allowed to live in very sparse rural areas and not get government services? Or should they get government services be brought together into the urban areas to make it more efficient and possible? And so on and so forth. So those issues will become apparent later.
Thank you, Neville. Moving forward, our last topic of the evening is biogeochemical cycles and feedbacks. Raissa, can you give us a couple of minutes on why those are important in a habitable planet?
All right. I think I'm probably going to be slightly shorter than a couple of minutes, but essentially biogeochemistry is a study of how chemical elements that we've heard about tonight, like oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, how those are cycled on Earth. And one thing we need to remember is that every element, every atom that is on Earth has been on Earth since the formation of Earth. And all of this matter is being recycled over and over and over. So biogeochemistry, it involves studying all the processes that basically move those elements from one part of the ecosystem, from soils to water, from water to phytoplankton to people. So how all those elements move around. And that goes through biological processes, chemical processes, and geological processes. So, for example, nutrients in the soil will undergo all sorts of transformation. They'll change from one form to another, and that's chemistry. And then the plants are able to take up these nutrients, so it's nitrogen and growth, and that's your biology. And when the plants die, they can decompose, or if the conditions are right, eventually they can become fossilized, and that's geology. But I think the most important part is not studying each of biology, chemistry, geology separately, but making sure we understand the interactions between them. And these interactions are what actually help make the Earth habitable. So what we've heard mentioned earlier, Carl talked about James Lovelock's theory about how the Earth is habitable, because life on Earth contributes to making the environment what it is. So, for example, we wouldn't have oxygen in the atmosphere if it wasn't for plants. And that's why the Earth is habitable for us humans, because obviously, as we discussed, there was other things living on Earth before plants. And those feedbacks, as we said, also help to regulate the climate. Again, as an example, the ocean takes a whole lot of carbon dioxide. And when everything is in balance, so when people are not putting a whole lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, that helps to keep carbon dioxide at the right levels and keeping the temperature at the right levels. So in that sense, biogeochemistry makes the Earth habitable.
Nice one. And so in this context, a cycle, right, we're not talking about a bicycle, it's a series of events.
It's a series of events. So say, for example, the nitrogen goes into the phytoplankton then grows, and then the phytoplankton sinks and it decomposes, and the nitrogen form goes back to that original nitrogen that was taken up.
And those transfers were referred to as fluxes, right?
Yeah, so it's referred to as fluxes. So yeah, sorry, the summary is a bit vague.
No, it's absolutely brilliant.
So basically looking at what we looked at is like the fluxes, so how fast, so where do those things go from? Do they go from the soil to the atmosphere? Do they get volatilized? Do they go from the water into biology? What are people eating? Because that's also part of it. What are things that are being decomposed? And it's also looking at the rates, which is how fast those things happen, because some things can stay in water for much longer than others. Some things will stay in the atmosphere much longer than others. Yeah, so that's.
And for some reason, the places they get cycled upon get called spheres, which is very odd, right? I mean, they're not really all circular or spherical.
I think it's, that's what, I didn't use the word spheres, I used parts of the system, instead of calling it spheres. So generally you call it the ecosphere, which is all the biology, the atmosphere, maybe that's where it all comes from. And what's the third one?
Rocks?
Rocks is a
lithosphere.
Lithosphere.
Okay.
You see, you don't all remember all the information.
And okay, so just quickly through the questions. There's only a few on this topic, so we'll be done very soon. And Busso asks about the nitrogen cycle. Is lightning the only way that nitrogen can get out of the air and into other forms?
Okay, so no. So there's two other main ways that nitrogen gets into bioavailable forms, so forms that plants and other biology can use, is through plants called legumes, so like your lentils, beans, and etc. So their roots have sort of, okay, I'm not a plant biologist, so I'm just so it's that kind of, their roots have ways of absorbing this nitrogen. And then you also have cyanobacteria, which are kind of, they're like in between algae because they photosynthesize, and bacteria because of their chemical composition. And they also have the ability of taking up the nitrogen from the atmosphere and converting it.
Okay, nice. Malone Titus asks, why will oxygen or carbon dioxide never run out? I think you've really covered that right at the start, that you made the point that all of the atoms in the Earth are here, they get recycled. That's really the big one, unless anyone else wants to contribute. I think that's a good answer.
Oh, excuse me.
Yes, we're getting to the end. What are the major chemicals required to sustain life on Earth? Vintry asks. I guess the first...
Yeah, we've been discussing this all night. We've been talking about oxygen and water.
Chicken and egg. I mean, it's basically the systems that have evolved with the material that is there becomes dependent on the system.
It's true.
And I think that's where the more biogeochemical cycles and what James Lovelock was saying, that the life on Earth makes the Earth habitable.
Yes, it's a self-fulfilling.
And I mean, the things like trace metals and trace elements are there. And for example, selenium and lithium, and they're in our bodies. They're part of some of our proteins.
They've been there forever.
And if we don't have them, we will get sick.
I remember learning that a lot of those trace elements were actually part of the sort of primordial soup, and that were so that the initial ocean that we had on Earth at sort of beginnings, all of those trace elements were there, and that's why they got incorporated into life.
Sure. But as Neville said, I mean, it's of opportunity, right? They were there and therefore they got used. But actually, there's carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus are the ones that people always go for, but equally important, magnesium,
the trace,
iron in
the ocean.
Exactly. All right. That concludes the most of the science. We have one topic left, which we will get through very quickly before closing. And that is the section of the questions which were really interesting, but I couldn't really fit into any of the topics. But I felt like they needed some oxygen and that we should get them out. So I'm going to quickly run through those. There's 4 or 5 of them, and then we'll close. Shineo asks, and this is to you, Neville, can a person who studied Bachelor of Environmental Science, major in Geography, work at the CSIR? If so, which department?
Yes, is the answer, I guess. But let me just explain that the CSIR is quite a diverse organization. It comprises 5 major units, of which one is natural resources and environment, in which we are working. But there's also biosciences, which is biochemistry and applied biochemistry. There's a material science unit. There's a defense, peace, safety and security unit, which does like missile systems and makes us our money. And then there is IT, and then there are different special units like the CHPC, the Satellite Application Center, and so on and so forth. What was the qualification in particular?
Geography, environmental science, majoring in geography. So NRE.
And there's also a consulting service as well. So the short answer is yes. However, I want to qualify that by just saying that having a degree, and even an honors degree, and possibly even a master's degree, isn't always enough. And often, because you compete with other qualified people, having generic skills is useful. It forms a basis of, and generic knowledge forms the basis of your employability. But it's often important to have specialized knowledge to find your niche. But then that said, the CSR is always recruiting. There's always opportunities, and often they take people with generic background skills and develop them in the job. So the short answer is yes.
Thank you, Neville. Siabonga asks, these are completely random, I can't link them, so I'm not going to even try. Asks, why do people think that, what makes science different from other fields? Why do people think it's difficult? You volunteered on that one?
Did I? Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Anyone want to come in on that?
I have a quote that I saw this morning.
Okay.
And it said, let me just open it up. So it said, chemists do not usually stutter. It would be very awkward if they did, seeing that they have at times to get words such as mifa, lifa, milo, finilium, and yes, that does sound really scary. I have a degree in chemistry and I have no idea what that is. So I think maybe science is seen as a language, and if you don't understand the language, and sometimes even if you think you do, there's some things that still sound crazy.
I can't really add to that, other than I don't think that science is difficult. It depends. You know, like in my experience, I just want to say one example.
Hang on, Guy.
When I did my background, I was in zoology and botany, whatever the case was, and I started a molecular PhD, and I learned as I went along. I had no clue what I was getting into, and I found the journey fascinating. To look at how you can use enzymes, and you can use biology to study biology, and you can do some cloning in bacteria, and you can do DNA sequencing, whatever. The point is that the journey is exciting, and that makes it not difficult if it's interesting and engaging, and you can be passionate about it, you can learn.
I don't know, I would disagree, because I think sometimes learning new things, it's a lot to take into your head.
I was definitely that.
And I think that's probably where sometimes people, you know, if you don't find it interesting enough, or if you're like, oh no, this is too hard, I'm not going to push through with it.
One more example is that once I had my data, I had to analyze my data, and then I had to sort of face the reality that I had to have mathematics, which I didn't have, and statistics I didn't have, and I plowed through it. I went and did the very basics of understanding the particular algorithms, the particular equations used in my particular analysis. So often it's when you need to apply the work that you get a better understanding of it, or if you need to teach it, as Guy said earlier.
Guy?
I think it's perceived of as difficult because it's abstract. So it's not concrete very often. You're learning about concepts. You have to imagine what a molecule looks like. You have to imagine evolution. You have to put together long chains of argument, long chains of logic, which means you've got to keep this house of cards in your mind. And that doesn't appeal to a lot of people. You know, a lot of people want to do business because they understand how to build a business, or they want to do art because they want to draw a house, or draw a mountain, or paint a mountain, or make a sculpture. Science is very much a practice of the mind, and that, I think, gives it it's a certain personality type, I think, that likes science.
But if you reduce science to its purest form, you have mathematics. And let me contrast learning maths with learning a language. In maths, you learn rules, and they aren't broken. In learning a language, you learn the rules, and then you have to keep learning the exceptions again and again and again, infinitely. To become fluent in a language, it's almost an infinite number of exceptions to rules. Why is the one difficult and the other is perceived as easy?
Well, not everyone thinks languages are easy.
But
No.
people think languages are easier than science.
I don't know if that's
the
true.
question.
I don't know if that's true.
I don't know if that's.
It depends what science you're talking about.
Okay, art history. There are an infinite number of artists to learn, and there's no obvious rules connecting them. It's just always. Whereas in maths, there's a finite number of rules to learn.
But science doesn't reduce to maths. Science definitely does not reduce to maths.
Yeah.
Well, you're a biologist guy. Physics might.
Well, yeah, but science, the study of stuff is more than maths. It's about logic. It maybe reduces to logic. It's a bit like being a detective. If you're a detective, you've got to ask difficult questions, and it's not only about asking stuff about things that you can see. You've got to also understand the things you don't see. So one of the biggest things a detective can ask is, what is missing from this picture? Not what can I see, but what can I not see? That's a very difficult question to answer.
And one there.
Okay, quickly.
It was that science is also not unartistic and uncreative. People also forget that, right? I find in trying to express yourself in a precise way, which is not ambiguous, which is efficient and understandable and replicable, if you like, is in itself an art. So I enjoy the language of science sometimes, be able to express myself, or how to represent a concept graphically. It takes a lot of imagination, and it's and so people mustn't think that science is not creative. It certainly is creative.
Yeah, I mean, even with designing your experiment, thinking of how am I going to do something new, that's also a big part of the creative process. It's very different. I can't paint or I can't draw to save my life, but I do still hope I have some creativity there.
In fact, what I think is another problem.
Curiosity.
It's an issue. In fact, is that if you look at science as a research process or as a research method, you actually learn it in steps. The whole honors year, you're learning probably just literature review and a few aspects of data collection. And only at masters you almost learn the whole thing. Then at a PhD, then you learn something bigger. But you only call a scientist or half of a scientist when you pass an honors. But it's so many years of learning. So it just takes a long time to be a professional who's a scientist who can publish papers and practice as a scientist. It takes a long time. Nobody wants to study that long before they can earn a decent income. Well, we do, but not everybody does.
Yeah, but the architect, doctor, lawyer, they all take just as long.
But I think also, we have to remember, for example, doctors are actually scientists.
Yes.
And there's always elements of science that come through different aspects of life. It's just people don't actually realize it.
True. Guy, did you want to just add one last very quick thing, and then we'll move on to the last question?
The fundamental thing about a scientist is that scientists are curious about the world. They have to know how the world works. If you have no curiosity about how the world works, don't do science, because you'll be bored for the rest of your life. That curiosity is the thing that you have to have in your gut. It's got to drive your every waking moment.
Thank you, Guy. I'm going to finish with the most blue sky question I think we've ever had. Sam Kaliswe asks, what would be the consequence if planet Earth was square and not round?
We'd fall off the edge.
You would definitely, sailing would be interesting as you went over the edge.
But I was also wondering if, how would it spin?
There would be some really
precession of Milankovitch cycles and all of that.
Yeah, well, and it could still spin. I mean, one thing would be the I suppose the problem is that it can't exist because of gravity, right? Yeah. And so then actually trying to predict the effects of that, like water, how would it flow? Well, it wouldn't because of gravity. It would soon just fall into a ball.
Changes to the day.
All right.
I want to go back to the first question. I'm still worried about the person who asked, how do you remember all of this? Or how do you keep it in your head? Because I think that's related to that other question about why is science hard?
I think the question here is more like, why do people think science is hard? Not
yes.
necessarily
I think it's very important we dispel this. So I wanted to just say that I think science is a way of thinking. it's not an accumulation of knowledge. I mean, of course, accumulating knowledge is an element of it, but it's a way of thinking. I think Guy also spoke about it. It's about curiosity, and then you need tools. You need to know. You need to know, for example, how to do literature review, like you've said. And I think in today's world, I mean, I use Google Scholar all the time now. Google Scholar is incredibly powerful, universal tools. The libraries are becoming redundant. The information is out there. It's a question of learning how to read the information, how to access the information, how to put the ideas together, how to collaborate. And I think collaborate is critically important, especially now because there is so much science, and science is growing as a more and more important. I think natural science is going to become more and more important as climate change and environmental change bites, global change bites. So I think it's really about how you think. It teaches you how to think about the world in a particular way. But it doesn't take any, so that's a set of unique skills or perhaps a set of unique interests, right? But I don't think that, you have to be particularly smarter than any other field or particularly, better at retaining knowledge, because all those fields, even, people that work in business and sell shares know the history of each share and whatever. So I think it's just a question of how you think about things and knowing the tools and the things that are available to you. I don't think it's hard. I think it's a language.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so can I just add, so from what Neville was saying science is a way of thinking. So for me, in my PhD, I studied 2 reactions in the ocean. And now I work as an environmental consultant, and they think I know everything about biogeochemistry. So answer all those biogeochemistry questions, and the only thing I can do is go and read about it to figure it out.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to offer up
Carl, can I add on something? Can I add on?
2 lines, Fabian. 2 lines.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that it's actually a myth. It's actually a myth that science is difficult. Because if you were to throw me in the political science or to do law, I would get lost, because for me it's quite difficult. It is so this myth is something that has been carried on all the way from our childhood, and those who don't enjoy science in such a way that people grow to think it's difficult. And so you ask a student 2 times 2, the next thing you see, all of them carry out calculators or their cell phones to give you an answer. So that's what I think about it. They just don't want to think anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabian. Guy, I can see that you're showing us a sand.
I want to show you the sand painting. This is a painting that was made by the San, probably 2,000 years ago, maybe older. This is a people that lived in the Cedarburg in the Western Cape. They figured out a way of creating a paint that would last thousands of years, right? And then this guy or woman painted this incredible painting. And I don't know if any of you can notice the science, which shows that science has a deep history in the human psyche. Because and when I ask about this painting, they say, oh, the person's got a knapsack on his back. The unique thing about this painting is that that bow is a perfect circle. It's the arc of a perfect circle. So this person knew how to draw a perfect circle. Those bowstrings are straight lines. This person drew that drawing 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years before the Greeks invented geometry. And I think it's an extraordinary example of human engagement in science. This is an abstraction. A bow doesn't look like that when you bend it. This person has put a model of a bow together. This person is a scientist. He lived 2,000, or she, 2 or 4, maybe 10,000 years ago. Science is deep in our psyche, deep in Africa. Science is a part of our lives, and we need to be proud of this.
That's brilliant and very topical. Thank you, Guy. Wendy or Siphelele, please raise your hand if you want to say something in closing. Just a couple of lines. You have a chance to raise your hand. Okay, I can see Spey. 2 lines, Spey.
Yeah, I just want to say, hard luck to those who's going to be writing exams during the actual events in Cape Town. Bye.
Cool. Anyone in the room would like to say anything in closing? All right, brilliant. In that case, I would like to once again thank our wonderful panel. They've been super. It's been a really, really interesting discussion. I hope it's been useful for everybody watching as well as for the panelists themselves. We can't do it without you guys. You put in a lot of time on a weekday night. We really appreciate it. Thank you ever so much for making your time available. And thank you to all the iPlaneteers who have participated in the course across South Africa and it would appear across the world. Good night from here in Cape Town. Thank you very much.
Bye.